We are live. Okay. Hello to all of those joining right now. We're going to start in a couple of minutes while people are trying to get into the room. دنباج و همین را اگر کو اون انگلیزی نکارن يعني گهداری بکن انجی پرسکریکیج بوی فهم کرنا انگلیزی هون دکارن بکردی گهدار بکن لبی آخافتنی دبشة ورقة interpretation تكارن كردي هالبجيرن أمي حتى دو دقيقة برنامج خود دست بید کن. I think we can start. People are still trying to get in, but I think we can start. Rojbash, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all joining us from different time zones, from different parts of the world. My name is Sardar Saadi, and I am the director of the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Rojava. On behalf of the Institute and the University of Rojava's community, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to the fourth lecture of the University of Rojava's Freedom Annual Lecture Series. While we are basically rolling our event, I'm going to ask Rosa to admit people, or Dr. Masuma, if you could do that, that would be great. Today, we are very honored to host Professor Mamosta Hamid Bozarslan for our fourth lecture. Mamosta is a well-known face among Kurdish academics. You all know, probably most of you know him very well. We will have a proper introduction later. Professor Bozarslan is joining us from Paris, France. And we are also honored to have my dear friend and comrade Rosa Burj with us today to moderate this lecture. This lecture is currently being live streamed on the University of Rojava's YouTube channel, and it will be accessible later on the university's YouTube channel, basically. And for those of you who are on Zoom, we have interpretation option from English to Kurdish Kurmanji and vice versa. As always, our dear friend Jalil Kaya is helping us today with interpretation. You can basically click on the globe icon on the right bottom side of your Zoom page and select Kurdish or English. Unfortunately, this option is not available on YouTube. We have allocated 20 minutes of this lecture, maybe more, depending on how we move forward for the questions and answers sessions with Professor Bozarslan. Please write your questions in the chat box or in the comment section on YouTube. So let me say all of that in Kurdish as well. هەوڵن هێژە باش بخێر هاتن چارمین گۆتارە ساڵانە ئازادی لە زانینگەها ڕۆژاوە ئەس گەلێک کەیف خۆشم و میوانداریەوە دکەم ناوێ من سەردار سادی ئەس هەفسەرۆکی نیستویە زانستن جواکی و مرۆڤی لە زانینگەها ڕۆژاوە ئێمە هینێک ئاگاهی دەربارەی وێ گۆتارەدا ئەم گەلێک کەیف خۆشم کوی ڕۆمامۆستا حەمید بۆزارسلان دگەلمەیە و هەروسا وەڵەمەی هێژە ڕۆزا بورج ڕێوەبەریە بێ گۆتارێ دکە ئەو گۆتار بە ئاوایەکی زیندی نەها لەسەر یوتوب بەڵاو دبە لێژ بۆی کەسێک کو دناو زوومێ دەنە ئەو ئیمکانە وەرگەر ji bo me heye wekî her carekî hûn dikarin li ser ew îkona globê ku li binî rastiya rûpela we ya Zoomê heye li ser ya biklîkînin û Kurdî helbijêrin. Mixabin wergera Kurdî tenê li ser Zoom heye û wekî min got li ser YouTubeê nîne. Okay, let me say a few words about our institute. The Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities is a center of research and graduate studies at the University of Rojava. It was established on October 11, 2020, based in Qamishlu, in Rojava, or the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East region of Syria, with instructors and contributors from all around the world, many of whom are with us today. The University of Rojava itself was founded on July 4, 2016, under circumstances of war and repression and political violence in Syria. The vice chair of the University of Rojava, Dr. Masouma Amini, today is with us. She's also the president of the Center for Graduate Studies at the University of Rojava. She will talk more about the university and basically doing a welcome message, welcoming you all to this lecture. So without further ado, please join me to welcome the vice chair of the vice co-chair of the University of Rojava, Dr. Masouma Amini, to present her message. Dr. Masouma, kalamka.
مرحبا دم باش جبو همو بشتاروانن حاضر دوه گوتاره ده از سپاسی همو بشتاروانان دکم به تایوه سپاسی پروفسور حمید بزارسلان دکم جبو پیشکش کرنا و گوتاره هیا که هند زانینگه روژاوا زانینگه روژاوا ده سال خویا هشتمین ده گهیشت آستکی اکادمیک کو بکار به خو به جهان بدن ناس کرن براستی دوی 8 ساله ده زانینگه روژاوا جبو مشاندن کار او خبات اکادمیک پر آستنگین مادی آستنگین ایریشن لشکری سیاسی و هر وکی دید لی دیساجی به حبونا و آستنگیان دیساجی کار و خبات اکادمیک خو دمشینه و سر لنگان سکنیه و هر وها کار خو ددومینه حتی دوی سالن داویده به هبونا و ایریشن لشکری پر باندورن نگاتیو سر خوندکار سر ماموستاین ما حاتیه و تیجی لی دیساجی ام کار و خبات اکادمیک خو نادن سکناندن و ام کار خو بردوام دکن و جبر کو ام دخازن هین بهتر خو بدن به دنیای ناس کرن و هر وها ام دخازن آرمان جمع اوه کو به پیش خستنا اکادمیک و کارن لکولینی خو ام بکاربن و هر وها به لدارخستنا و بشداربون دوی گوتاران ده ام بکاربن هفگرتی کی اکادمیک ده ناو زانگهان ده و هر وها ده ناو اکادمیسیان به اکادمیسیان در و چه بکن و جبر وی از ادی درج ناکم از پر جاره کی دن سپاسی همو بشتاروانان دکم و سپاسی همو وادکم و بخیر هاتنه ودکم گلک سپاس
Express, Dr. Mahsuma. Let me now introduce Rosa Burj, who will introduce our speaker and moderate this lecture. Rosa Burj is a political sociologist who has specialized in transnational orders of violence, mobilization in conflict, political imaginaries, and effective legacies of stateless communities. She's a member of the Center on Social Movement Studies in Florence, Italy, where she has written a PhD dissertation on Kurdish non-state seeking mobilization. Rosa is currently a project coordinator at the German Institute for Migrant Research, where she researches the impact of transnational racism on inter-migrant relations. She is also an affiliated scholar of the Center for Interdisciplinary Peace and Conflict Research, Interact, at the FU Free University, Berlin, I assume. So the screen is yours, Rosa.
Thank you, Sardar. I now have the pleasure of starting the lecture and introducing our distinguished guest to the audience. Before I do so, I also want to extend my thank you to you, Sardar, and to Masuma Amini, and also to all the dear colleagues in Rojava for organizing the fourth lecture, despite all the challenges imposed by the ongoing conflict. We gather here today to reflect on anti-democracy and war in the 21st century, a topic of great importance given the contemporary global landscape and the multi-scalar violent order in Kurdistan. And before I start with the introduction of our distinguished guest, I would also like to encourage all of us, as we will think about this topic throughout the lecture, to also keep remembering the significance of today's date, the 24th of April, the anniversary of the Armenian genocide, which continues to remind us of the intertwined histories, geographies, and collective memories of violence, survival, and resistance. So I will now take a moment, with great pleasure indeed, to introduce our speaker to the audience. But I think this audience actually doesn't need this introduction, but I will still go ahead, because it's honestly a pleasure to be moderating this here today. Professor Hamid Bozarslan is not only an expert on the Middle East, Turkey, and the Kurdish issue, but he is above all a public intellectual who has contributed significantly to our understanding on violence, mobilization, authoritarian regimes, and their legacies. For many years, I think almost 20 now, he has been the director of studies at the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris, and he's the author of an extensive body of works. His latest book carries the title The Time of Monsters, which was published in French in 2022. And his list of publications is very, very long. I mean, from edited volumes, single-authored books, articles, essays. But what is important here, they are all, and this is what I would like to emphasize, they are all manifestations of intellectual interventions, always at times when we try to make sense of the entrenching authoritarianisms, shrinking spaces, and wars that are unfolding. In his lecture today, Hamid Bozarslan will provide us with an analytical perspective on the recent conflicts, including Rojava and Artsakh, as far as I understood. And he will also be doing this by introducing the concept of what he calls wars of decivilization. After the lecture, we will have about 30 minutes of Q&A, so you can write down your questions in the chat. We will try to collect and address as many of them as possible, but without taking any more time, and with gratitude and anticipation, Mr. Hamid, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, especially Kurdish galgal bezim. Dr. Rosa Burj, Dr. Masume, Dr. سردار از گله که خوشم که ایرو از بویرمه از زانم که شرطن گله که دجوار دا اون کار کن و از بو همیان اتخاذ کم و باورم گله که مهمه که نوابان شرطن خراب دا نواب زوردستی که پرمزن دا که خباتا akademik karibe berdağım ben. So I will switch into English, and I thank from the bottom of my heart to Dr. Rosa Burch and Dr. Masuma, of course, Kek Serdar. It is a real pleasure and honor to be here today with you to discuss on the issue of violence in the Middle East. And Rosa, I think that you were absolutely right. 24th of April. It means that a long period of mass violence, of extermination and genocide that started under the Committee Union and Progress in the Ottoman Empire continues to some extent in different forms in many parts of the Middle East, in the Rojava, of course, but not exclusively, and in other parts of the world too. And in my intervention today, I'd like to start with the Palestinian issue because we have a war going on, and this war is a very significant war for many reasons. I will come back to this issue, and I will end with the Kurdish conflict. As I said, I will start with the brutal war going on today in the Gaza region in Palestine. And I think that this war requires us, before everything else, to express our solidarity with the civil population in Gaza, because since 7 months, more than 2 million people, they are suffering from very difficult conditions, from a brutal violence going on. But at the same time, I think that we have to take the opportunity of this war in order to understand the crisis of the Israeli society, the crisis of the Palestinian society, and the crisis also of the Middle Eastern societies. I will start with Israel. And it is very interesting to see that actually many people, many fellows among us, we don't know that at the beginning of the Israeli society or the Israeli state, we have what we call the Zionism, which was in its own historical period in the 19th century, a movement of socialist tendency, being a part of what was called the spring of the peoples or the awakening of the peoples. The Zionism had an European origin, and as I said, it had also a socialist origin, and the Israeli state has not been built by the British imperialism, as many people can say, but when Israel has been built, the United States and Soviet Union, they supported Israel together. For one, it was one of the meaning of ways of being present in the Middle East, and for Soviet Union, that was an anti-imperialist state and a would-be socialist state. But from the very beginning, it was also impossible. It was also obvious that it was impossible to have an ethnocracy, having a state of Jews who survived the Holocaust from the Holocaust, but at the same time, they could not be a confessional religious state and a democratic state. And the crisis of the Israeli society, internal crisis, but also external crisis, that has continued since the beginning of the state, has been amplified, has been intensified after 1967, and particularly after the 1990s. And today, in Israel, many democratic forces are extremely aware and worried by the fact that the state has become a supremacist state, a state of domination of religious sects, a state of domination of the kleptocracy and militarist forces. And I think that we have to be aware of this evolution. That does not mean that we have to deny the existence of Israel. Israel is there, is a part of the Middle East, but at the same time, the fight for democracy in Israel is also the fight for Palestine and the fight for a democratic Middle East. So the criticism of Israel is required, is necessary. Israel needs our criticism rather than our support. But at the same time, I would say that the Palestinian society itself is in crisis, and in a similar way, the Palestinian society requires our criticism rather than our support alone. Palestine is a defeated society. And as Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century historian, has explained, the defeated societies do not have a history. Their history belongs to the history of those who dominate them. This society has been fragmented, not only alongside the refugee camps, alongside Gaza and the West Bank, but this society has been also fragmented internally. Now we have some 500,000 settlers settled in the West Bank. And this Palestinian society, unfortunately, was not able to provide new alternatives, particularly after the Second Intifada of the beginning of the years 2000s. And in the evolution of this society, I would say that the Hamas was not a part of the solution, but rather was a part of the problem. And I think that whatever the support that we can give, we must give to the Palestinian society, to the Gazawi society. We have to be aware that the 7th of October has changed a lot of things, and we cannot support in any case what happened on the 7th of October. 7th of October was a moment of responsibility before everything else, the ethical responsibility, killing of 1,200 people, but that was also a responsibility in terms of rationality. We still do not know who has taken the decision to organize these attacks, why this decision has been taken, but we know that those who have taken this decision, they thought that the history of the world, the history of Palestine, the history of Israel could be reduced into 27 hours. They thought that through a series of attacks, history could be changed, but they could not anticipate, they didn't want to anticipate on the extremely heavy cost of such a decision. And this destruction of rationality has to be questioned, has to be criticized. And as I said, there is also the issue of responsibility. Who within the Hamas organization has taken this decision? Why? On what ground? I think that all these questions have to be asked. Many people thought that behind this decision, that was the wish of liberating the prisoners. It is true that there were some 7,500 Palestinian prisoners in the Israeli jails. Many of them, they were in very difficult conditions. Many of them, they were not guilty of anything. But at the same time, when you see that today we have almost 40,000 civilians killed, you cannot justify these killings in the name of liberation of the prisoners. And at the same time, some others said that behind this decision of 7th October, that was the will of breaking down the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Israel. But we saw today that in reality, Saudi Arabia helps Israel and not Iran. And in the region, I would say that we have a very complex situation. No one in the region, in the Middle East, has actually supported or supports the Palestinian issue or the Palestinian cause. It is impressive to see that the Arab world is in a total silence. We had in October some public manifestations in North Africa, but today, even in these countries, there is almost nothing. Cairo is silent. Riyadh is silent. Baghdad is silent. Almost all Arab capitals are silent. And there is no diplomatic, strategic, or moral support given to the Palestinians. In Turkey, the president has made some very harsh declarations, but at the same time, we saw that in Turkey, not either, there was nothing diplomatically changing in relations with Israel, and on the contrary, the commerce with Israel has continued. And when you take the case of Iran and its allies, the Hezbollah organization in Lebanon, Hashd al-Shaabi in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and the Fatimiyun and the Husseiniyun and the others and the Pasdaran in Syria. Actually, we see that they organized a militia-based diplomacy, but at the same time, they explain again and again that at the stake there is the game of hegemony of Iran and not at the end the liberation of Palestine or the wish of improving the conditions of Palestine. And unfortunately, we see that today, not only in Gaza, but broadly speaking, Palestine has remained alone. And that's a very difficult situation for all of us. And the issue that we can ask ourselves is how Palestine can become a subject of its own history. When you take the long history of the 20th century, you see that Palestine has never been actually a subject of its own history. It has been either defeated by the Israeli forces or abandoned or manipulated by the regional governments. In 1947, 1948, Palestine did not exist. There was no Palestinian actors. There was no Palestinian forces. There were only the Arab armies, and the Arab armies that thought that they could defeat the Palestinian, the Israeli forces very easily. The end was the Nakba, a catastrophe for the Palestinians. In 1967, once again, we had such an evolution. The Arab armies thought that they could defeat Israel in a couple of days. The outcome was the destruction of the Arab armies and the second Palestinian issue, the Nakba. After the Nakba in 1948, you had also the Nakba in 1967. In 1970, during the Black September, the Palestinians in Jordan have been totally abandoned, and some between 3,500 and 10,000 Palestinians have been killed. When you take the Lebanese civil war in the 1980s, again, the Palestinians have been massacred by many Arab forces, many Arab countries, and abandoned them. And today, I think that the Palestinian society is a defeated society, but still a dynamic society. A dynamic society in which there are intellectual resources, in which there are resources of citizenship, in which there are many women engaged in the fight for emancipation, both national emancipation, but also gender emancipation. And I hope that this Palestinian society will be able to produce new political alternatives, knowing that these new political alternatives cannot be Islamist alternatives, cannot be jihadi alternatives, and cannot be alternatives based on violence. They have to be new political alternatives. But when we take the situation in Gaza, we also see that this war going on is only one of the wars of decivilization. Very often, particularly in the left wing, among the left wing militants, we disregard the notion of civilization. We think that the civilization is a bourgeois notion. We think that civilization is corrupted, or the civilization is only a Western civilization wanting to dominate the world. But actually, when you take a very long historical tradition going back to Ibn Khaldun, but which has also determined the Enlightenment, you see that civilization is neither Eastern nor Western. The civilization is neither Christian nor Islamic or Chinese or Indian. Civilization is trust in time and in space. And recently, the wars that we have observed since 10 or 15 years have been the wars of destruction of time and space. They have been the wars of destruction of trust. They have been the wars of destruction of urbanity, and they have been the wars of destruction of civilization. The concept of decivilization that has been proposed by Norbert Eliasson in the 1950s and 1960s means that you cannot trust anymore, neither in time nor in space. You cannot give a meaning to your past. You cannot project yourself in your future. And the destruction becomes the only moment where your history starts. That was the case during the Armenian genocide. The meaning of the genocide was to say to the Armenians that their history had no more any meaning and that they had no more any future. The only moment that they will have is the moment of their destruction. The Holocaust was such a situation. And we see that since a couple of years, we have almost exactly the same situation, the destruction of civilization, destruction of urbanity, time, and space. And the recent wars, both in the Middle East and elsewhere, have been the war of destruction of the urbanity. Very long wars in time, but at the same time, wars concentrated in space. Just take the Syrian civil war. We use the concept of Syrian civil war, but actually we have no civil war. We have something much worse than the civil wars that the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, called, defined by the notion of stasis, the war of destruction, the war of annihilation of a society. And in this war in Syria, we saw many parts of the Syrian society, many parts of the Syrian urban society have been destroyed. Syria of 2020, 2011 had a population of 22, 23 million of people. Today, we have 500,000 people killed, and we have 12, 13 million of people either exiled or internally displaced. The Syrian society has been basically destroyed. And the Syrian so-called civil war was a war of decivilization. Take another case, Rojava, Afrin, Terekaniye, Graspin, who have been destroyed by Turkey. These places have been transformed into a jihadistan, where the jihadi groups fought each other in order to have the maximum of booty. And in this war, we had on one part the cynicism of Russia, of Putin, who wanted to negotiate and improve her relations with Turkey. And on the other side, we had the cynicism of the administration of Donald Trump. And today, in these parts of Rojava, the Kurdish population has vanished off. Afrin had a Kurdish population of 90%. Today, probably in Afrin, the Kurdish population is less than 10%. And when I hear in Turkey some AKP members or partisans criticizing Israel, what I want to say to them is that if Netanyahu is Gaza's hangman in Rojava, Rojava's Netanyahu is named Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Take another case. We are on April 24th. Karabakh, Nagorno-Karabakh in the Caucasus, officially in the Azeri territories in Azerbaijan, but where the population was almost 100% Armenian, and this region has been destroyed. Once again, the urbanity has been destroyed, civilization has been destroyed. And in this war, Russia, Turkey, and Israel, they have supported Azerbaijan against the Armenians. Russia, because Armenia has done its own revolution, and Putin does not like democratic revolutions. Turkey, because Turkey has never abandoned the project of building a narrow Turan, which was the theory of Ziya Gökalp, the Turkish doctrinaire of 1910s and 1920s. And for Ziya Gökalp, because it was not anymore possible in 1917 to create a grid Turan, a small, narrow Turan has to be created. And this narrow Turan has to unify Turkey and Azerbaijan, which means the destruction of Armenia. And Israel has supported during this war Azerbaijan, not because Israel is against the Armenians, but because Israel has also acted in a very cynical way against Iran. She has supported Azerbaijan. And when you take the case of Ukraine, you have once again a similar situation. We speak very much about Ukraine as a global war. It is, of course, a global war. It is a war on an independent country, a war that a country that Putin has recognized as an independent and sovereign country in 2004. But at the same time, when you see behind this global war, what is going on is the war on urbanity. Each stage of war in Ukraine is a war on an urban space that can continue weeks or months on a very narrow space, bombed during many weeks, many months, liberated, so-called liberated or lost, but at the same time, the population is destroyed. So we have a form of war which is against life, which is against urbanity, and which is against civilization. And these wars have also, of course, a genealogy, because when you take the 1990s, in 1990s, for me, the war of the synonymous of war of Spain of 1930s was the war in Bosnia, the siege of Sarajevo, which continued during more than 2 years. When you take the Second World War, once again, you have the war of destruction of urbanity. When you take the civil war, the so-called civil war in Spain, once again, you have a war of destruction of urbanity, and Guernica in Spain was the very symbol of this destruction of urbanity. And behind these wars of this civilization, we have systematically the emergence of anti-democratic regimes. And when you take the last wars of last 15 years, you have systematically involved anti-democratic regimes. Turkey and Russia, for instance, Erdogan and Putin, they think that the Russian nation or the Turkish nation has a historical mission, and that this mission is to dominate the world. And that this mission that has been given by history has been also confirmed or certified by God, because God is transformed into instances of war. Quran or Bible are read as sources of legitimization of war. So you have history, you have God, and you have Darwin or science, because these regimes think that the nature is made of war, and that in the nature only the strongest nation can win. And this legitimization, which is both metaphysical, theological, and so-called scientific legitimization of the war, makes them, they absolutely do not recognize any form of law, international law, or the law, interstate law, or the law that can assure some kind of immunity to the civil populations. And in these wars, you see clearly that the instance that conduct the war is not the state. Putin explains it. That's not the Russian state. That's the Russian nation that has the right to dominate, and the war is conducted by the Russian state. The sovereign entity is the Russian state, the nation. When you take Erdogan, once again, you have the very notion that the Turkish state is only an organ of the Turkish nation, and when Turkey invites, occupies Afrin, that is the Turkish nation itself that invites or occupies Afrin. And for all these regimes, anti-democratic regimes, it is important that the space and spices are juxtaposed. They cannot imagine that a space cannot be Turcified or cannot be occupied by the Russian nation. Here, very clearly, you have the notion of Lebensraum, vital space, that Hitler has promoted during his reign. And for all these regimes, anti-democratic regimes, mainly Turkey and Russia, but I can also mention, of course, Iran in a very different context. The history of the world is the history of the war. And in this history of the war, the past has been the past of the defeat, but the future has to be the future of the avenge or revenge. For Erdogan, but also for Russia, for Putin, the future cannot be a future of equality between the nations, equality between the states, equality between the races. The future cannot be the future of law or rights. The future can be only the future of war, because only thanks to the war, the historical mission can be accomplished. And such a perspective, I see that it's quite important to take into account, because when you have such a perspective, you cannot have a pacified world. And what is very important to see also, that vis-a-vis such evolutions, the democratic regimes are very often extremely passive. They do not act, and they capitulate before the anti-democratic regimes. You had this fact already in the 1920s and 1930s. In the 1920s, the democratic countries have accepted the capitulation before Mustafa Kemal of Turkey. And we know that Turkey has been built by the organizers of the genocide, because the cadres that have built Turkey, they have massively participated to the genocide. Those who have been in the team of Talat Pasha and have conducted the genocide have governed Turkey until the 1950s. And in 1915, France and Great Britain explained that the organizers of this mass crime, they will be punished. But already by the 1920s, Mustafa Kemal's Turkey has been rehabilitated. That was not the case of the Arabs. The Arabs have been punished. The Kurds have been divided, but Turkey has been rehabilitated. And similarly, in the 1920s, 1930s, Mussolini was able to occupy Ethiopia, to conduct a very brutal war, and at the same time, the Western democracies or the existing democracies of this period, they have capitulated. And we see also that in Spain, while Italy and Germany were intervening massively in order to destroy a democracy, an elected democratic government, the democracies were not there. The democracies did not protect Spanish democracy. And today, in a very similar way, we have a form of capitulation. In the 1914 and 2010, 13, 14, when Crimea had been occupied, the democracies have not acted. And when Rojava, part of Rojava, have been transformed into a jihadistan, once again, democracies remained silent. As I said, I started with the Palestinian issue. I would like to end with Kurdish issue, because in Kurdish issue, when we see the Kurdish history, we have a history of violence throughout the 20th century, almost. Coercion, revolts, repression. And since 1961, there is not a single historical period in which one part of Kurdistan is not in a state of revolt or in a state of massive coercion and in a state of violence. When you take the period of 1961 to 2023, 2014, and 24, we have hundreds of thousands of people killed in the Kurdish region, broadly speaking. Thousands of villages have been destroyed, many towns have been destroyed, and generations, many generations, they have had a history of brutality and of violence. And violence is not only the state coercion, violence is also the refusal of any kind of recognition of Kurdish existence and equality. And we see that today in Turkey concerning the Kurdish municipalities. So violence is there, and still I think that compared to the past, the Kurdish situation today is a still very precarious situation, but we find it ourselves in a much better situation than 30 or 40 years ago. Just take the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was a widespread of pessimism. In 1980s, the Kurdish uprising has been crashed down in Iran. In 1980s, the Anfal operation has destroyed them. Many parts of the southern Kurdistan. In the 1980s, there was a brutal military regime in Turkey, and in 1980s, in the Rojava, there were some cultural activities, some political activities, but one could not speak about the existence of the autonomous Kurdish movement. Of course, to that, one also has to add that in the 1980s, the internal Kurdish relations, they were absolutely violent ones. There were many cases of Brakuji, fratricide wars. Today, the situation is still very problematic. No one knows what will happen with the Kurds, with Kurdistan, with 4 parts of Kurdistan in the future, in 2030s, 2040s. But still, I would say that we are in a much better shape than in the 1980s. We are in a much better shape because there are de facto 2 autonomous regimes in Bashur and in Rojava. We are in a much better shape because there is an incredible dynamism in Kurdistan. In Turkey, we saw that during the elections. I think that in Turkey, the elections have never been so much fraudulent as this year. In spite of that, and in spite of the confiscation of municipality in Kars, Şırnak, and Bitlis by the AKP forces, and that was simply a confiscation, the Kurdish movement has succeeded beyond any form of optimism or hope. When you take the Iranian Kurdistan, Rojava, the movement of Jiyan Azadi has become a dynamic force, a dominant force, not only in Kurdistan, but throughout Iran. And today, there is a passive civil resistance in Kurdistan, in Rojava, going on. But of course, the main fragile regions are the Bashur and Rojava, the southern Kurdistan and Rojava. There is a favorable, semi-favorable situation, but unfortunately, we see also that we have a lot of problems concerning the internal integration. these problems of internal integration can be observed, particularly in Bashur, where southern Kurdistan and northern of southern Kurdistan, they are not integrated. And this in spite of more than 30 years of autonomy. And one cannot deny that in Bashur, both Iran and Turkey exert a huge influence. They can be together concerning Kirkuk. They both are against any form of viable Kurdish autonomy. And at the same time, they exert a huge pressure in order to create a dominated, infeuded Kurdish region there. And we see also that in Rojava, Turkey has never accepted the existence of a Rojava, and Kobane, the Kobane resistance, has been the turning point in Turkey in the evolution of Erdoganism, that the Islamic State could not conquer Kobane, and that the end of Islamic State has started in Kobane, has been and still remains problematic for Turkey. And unfortunately, we have also a problem of integration, internal integration between Bashur and Rojava. And I think that the most urgent task today for the Kurds is to create this internal integration. Of course, we know, as I mentioned, Iran and Turkey, they are dominant forces there. And we have a kind of returning back to the 16th century, the logic of the 16th century of dividing Kurdistan, creating a zone, a buffer, not a buffer zone, but the fragmented buffer zones in Kurdistan in order to separate the both regions. But I think that the Kurdish regions, the Kurdish actors are able, must be able to imagine themselves also as subjects of their own history. At the beginning of my talk, I said that unfortunately the Palestinians, they were not subject of their own history. And today, what is urgent in Palestine is to become subject of their own history, not to become independent to the Arab forces, Arab countries, or to Iran. And similarly, I would say that what is the most urgent thing today for the Kurds, that cannot forget, of course, the presence of Iran and Turkey, is to becoming subjects of their own history. Very often when I say that the Kurds are a minority, many Kurdish fellows, they are upset saying that the Kurds are not a minority, they are a majority. But when you take what Kant has said about minority, minority is the group that cannot become a subject of its own history. Today, the Kurds have to become a majority, but the condition of becoming this majority, it means leaving behind them the status of minority, saying that we do exist, we have a common history, we have a common future, we decide our future either with the states or without the states in the forms that we want, is also to becoming a subject and to becoming able to resist to these external pressures from Turkey and from Iran. And I think that in both countries, in Turkey and Iran, armed solution is not a solution. Probably the period of the violent resistance is over. And in Turkey, we see that very clearly. The municipal forces are much more important today than any kind of armed resistance. In Iran, Jin Jiyan Azadi as a slogan is much more efficient than many other forms of armed resistance. But of course, the future of Kurdistan is also decided in Rojava and Bashur. And in Rojava and Bashur, unfortunately, the arms are required. The arms are necessary. And the Kurdish actors must be the master of these arms and not letting the other countries of the region to dominate the Kurdish space and these arms. So I will stop here. I thank you so much for your listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Bozarslan. This was illuminating as always, and I took so many notes. It's always a bit of interesting situation. One time I was sitting with you on a panel, but I always feel like a student continuing to learn, and it's always trying to navigate the roles that one has. And now today I have to moderate, but it was a real pleasure to listen to you. All of us, the audience, is now welcome to write the questions in the chat, but I will use my position as the moderator and maybe to have an opening question, because it really stayed with me, the whole notion of the defeated society and becoming a subject of your own history. And it also reflects many of the subjectification trajectories that people have in their biographies when they mobilize within the Kurdish movement, for instance. And I wondered, also because you started with the Palestine issue, I noticed since October that whenever in the public sphere or in academia we speak of emancipatory movements, there is somehow no space and no place for the imaginary of the Kurdish struggle of becoming a subject. So I wondered, especially looking at the Middle East, why is it that the Kurdish struggle, be it the Kobani resistance, the Zinjan Azadi movement, Rojava, or HDP in Turkey, or DEM Party today, why is it not part of a revolutionary imaginary that is beyond Kurdistan in the Middle East? This would be my question, and now I'm going to collect also, in the meantime, the questions from the audience.
Do you want me to reply right now, or yes? Actually, I think that's a very good question, and I think that here we need some historical perspective. When you take the 1960s and 1970s, 1980s, you have two revolutionary actors. One is trans-border, the other one is supra-territorial, Kurdish and Palestinian ones. And no wonder that both of them, they are defeated minorities, and both of them, they wanted to overcome their status of minority in order to become majorities. But I think that in the 1960s, 1970s, there was a common political language. The Kurdish political language could be translated into Persian, into Turkish to some extent, definitely into Arabic. Don't forget that the PKK, for instance, has given its first loss in Lebanon in 1982. The first 16 victims of PKK, they are fallen in the fight against the Israeli occupation. Talabani was very close to Nasser and was very close also to the Palestinian movement. But I think that after the 1980s, for the many historical reasons, the Middle East has experienced a form of internal differentiation. Islamism has become the dominant actor in the Arab world. In Iran, the left-wing movements have been defeated. In Turkey, the left-wing movements have been defeated. And the possibility of having a common political language, translating the Kurdish political language into Arabic political language, has become extremely complicated. You cannot translate it today, the Arab political grammar, into Kurdish. The fact that there is a conflict between the Shias and the Sunnis, the fact that power is a power of militia forces, that there is the jihadist transhumancy, all these factors cannot be translated into Kurdish. Of course, you have also a Kurdish jihadism. Of course, you have also a Kurdish intersectarian problem, but they are not the dominant ones. Even in Bashur, the Islamist movement, they obtained 15-16% of the votes, and for a while being in, they cannot become the dominant force. In Turkey, Hezbollah is massively supported by the state, but they cannot go beyond 0.3 or 0.4%. While when you take the Arab world, the Arab societies, the situation is very different. So I think that all these factors, they do intervene, and it means that Kurdistan cannot be able today, at least, to become a reference for the rest of the Middle East, except in Iran. I think that in Iran, the movement of Zinjan Azadi has changed, has had a very strong transformative effects on Iran, including in Balochistan. The fact that in Balochistan, the religious apparatus today asks for secularism, and that the Sunni religious apparatus authorizes the women to became a part of the public protests, shows that in Iran, the Kurdish movement was able to send a message, and that this message has become an Iranian message. In Turkey, that might become the case tomorrow, if there was a democratic movement in Turkey, not a Kemalist movement, not a Kemalist secularist movement, but a democratic Turkish movement, let's say representing 10 or 15% of the population. In this case, that can be the case, but for wide being, that's not the case. But as I said, I mean, in Iran, we saw that the Kurdish message could become a much more national Iranian message than excluded the Kurdish message.
Thank you. There are now some questions in the chat, and because we have some time and it's nice to have an interaction, my suggestion would be if those who posed the questions want to address them personally, we would just unmute them. So I would start with Murat. Ruhi, would you like to just write it to me so I can? Would you like to address your question maybe personally? Can we unmute our? I cannot see the person. Yeah, there you go. Yes, we can hear you now. If you would like to address your question, you can do it in person.
Hello. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to hear such a progressive stance as it was presented by Hamid. Sorry that I'm not using doctor, professor, and these things. So it is really exciting that, you know, in the middle of these all ongoing wars, seem kind of endless wars in the region, from Nagorno-Karabakh to Rojava to Palestine, and to the daily war waged on the Iranian women, Kurdish and Iranian women in Iran. So such a progressive understanding of the dynamic of war and the brutality in the region. It is really, and I do really appreciate it that you highlighted the democratic forces within the Israeli society as well. So we criticize Israeli state and this apartheid regime, which we see how it has devastated the Palestine, but at the same time, it is very important to highlight that both in Israel, but also, and more importantly, in diaspora, in Europe, in the US, so the Jewish community, leftist and democratic Jewish community are at the forefront of every single protest against the apartheid in Palestine. So it is very important to highlight these democratic forces. My question actually was about the term Lebensraum. So we know that Daoud Oglu, was one of the greatest fan of this term. Actually, he is a student of this school, I think. And no, he's not in the power, but the concept I think informs the Turkish policy in the region, not just in the Middle East, but also in other regions too. How these terms is used by Turkey to justify its new Ottomanism in the region, but it is not just the policy of the Turkey. We see that Iran has played a regional game for years, at least from the very beginning of the revolution, and more systematically after the conclusion of Iran and Iraq war. So how this concept has resulted into a new regional game, which doesn't see and doesn't consider even the colonial borders as seriously, and it plays its game, you know, and especially in these new years, in the very in the last decade, we see that new Ottomanism and new kind of Safavism, if we could use the term, is really a game and a real thing in the region, and it just intervention into regional affairs, into the affairs of other countries, it has become a norm actually. So is it just Turkey and Iran who are doing this game, or we can speak of other countries with the same policy in the region? Sorry if it is too long. I am just asking one more question, and it is about the Turkish, the Turkish civil society. And I am happy that you used not a Kemalism movement, a democratic movement, which is usually completely two different things. How these Turkish civil society react to the Turkish state policy when it is outside of Turkish cities and towns? Do they really prioritize democratic values if Turkey is bombing Kurdistan, when Turkey is bombing Rojava and is bombing Bashur? Do we see any sincere democratic movement within Turkish, not the Kurds who are assimilated into Turkish, within the Turkish society? Do we see any sincere movement who voice up the same way that the Jewish society voiced up against the Israeli policy? Do we see anything within the Turkish society? Sorry, it was too long, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Murat Rohi. I am really very happy that you have asked these questions, and thanks for your kind comments too. For the first question, I think you are absolutely right. Davutoğlu has used the references of the 19th century Germany, particularly after 1870. And in 1870, after 1870 war, you see very clearly in Germany emerging the idea of Turkish space. Turkish means that that's not the state which is the sovereign entity, that's the folk. That means the ethnic group. And in this case, you are not in the Westphalian logic, because the Westphalian treaties of 1648 have accepted the state as the sovereign entities, while in this case, that's not the states, that the interests of the nation, of the ethnic group that is determined, and the ethnic groups cannot have, of course, the state boundaries. They can go beyond state boundaries, and ethnic groups can extend or defend their so-called interests through arms, and that has been determined. This fact that has determined Nazi Germany's policy, and Hitler has explained many times that Germany has to abandon the logic, the hateful logic of the Westphalian treaties. So the Lebensraum. And for Davutoğlu, that was very clear. Davutoğlu said that in his book, the very famous book, The Strategic Deepness, that the 19th century and the 20th century were the centuries of modernity, and he adds, thanks God, modernity is dead. We are entering into the period of globalization, but this period of globalization is in fact a new social Darwinist period. And social Darwinism was this theory that explained that the societies, that the nations were species in war with each other, and that only the strongest species could win the war. So from that perspective, I think that you are absolutely right. You have a genealogy. And actually, I would say also that to some extent in Iran, you have a similar situation. When you take Ahmed Farid, that the Iranians do not know today, and he has not written so much, but he has been very influential in the 1960s and 1970s, as Ali Shariati, for instance. He was, or he considered himself as a student of Heidegger, and he explained that that was the right of the community, unconscious communities that are incarnated in knowledge or in consciousness. And I think that very clearly when you see the text of Khomeini, even the text of Khomeini, the doctrine of Vilayat al-Faqih, the first declaration of Khomeini on the fact that the Iranian revolution cannot recognize any form of borders, you are very clearly in the logic of expansion. And in Iran, that's very interesting to see that after 1988-89, Khomeini dies in 1989, the two last revolutionary measures that he takes is the fatwa against Salman Rushdie and the execution of some 5,000 political prisoners. And you enter in the period of Rafsanjani. And after this period, the Iranian revolution has no other content than the formation of the militia forces elsewhere. Hezbollah was the first militia force, and today we see the increase of these militia forces at least in 4 countries. So from that point of view, I think that you are absolutely right. And concerning the Turkish civil society, the reading that I have, but Rosa can complete my comments and other colleagues too, there are spaces of resistance in Turkey, spaces of intellectual resistance. There are absolutely brilliant academics, and I think that these academics, they are very courageous academics. In very difficult conditions, they continue to produce an intellectual life. They continue to construct a world of meanings, because Erdoganism is the world of destruction of meanings, the past, the future, whatever you can imagine. But unfortunately, these forces are extremely minority today. The main political force in Turkey is, as you know, the Republican People's Party, CHP or CHP, and this party in 2023, during the elections of 2023, has not even formulated the issue of democracy as a legitimate issue, has absolutely not touched to the Kurdish question, and has explained that the opposition was as nationalist and as conservative as the AKP. And that, of course, could not lead to anywhere. And that's why in a couple of occasions, I have explained that in Spain, the democratization was possible because at once there was a democratic demand within the Spanish society, legitimization of democracy. But at the same time, this legitimization of democracy went hand in hand with the legitimization of the Catalan and the Basque issues, the struggles of the Catalan and Basque communities or peoples. And the Spanish democratic forces have accepted that between, let's say, 75 and the constitution of 78, 79, I don't remember exactly the date. And in Turkey, you cannot have a democratization if the main political party is not even daring speaking about the democracy and does not put the question of Kurdish issue as the main crucial issue of the country. For while being, we are not there, but as I said, we have spaces of resistance.
Thank you so much. I think there is a lot to discuss and speak, especially also after what we witnessed with the Van case. But I mean, very, very interesting. I would now suggest that I present you 2 or 3 questions in the chat. Then we have Birgül Kutan, who's raising her hand to address her question herself. You can, for the audience, you can also just raise a hand, and then we would just open, or you can open your video and we will unmute you. So one question, because it was directly linked to the Lebensraum. Ayşe, without a last name, asks, wouldn't it be correct to say that the US also employs the concept of Lebensraum to justify its policies, for instance, vis-a-vis the Iraqi war in Latin America? This would be one question. Then our colleague Hanife Barış asks you why you still use the categories of the Palestinian issue or the Kurdish issue instead of replacing them with Israeli occupation, colonialism, Turkish occupation / colonialism, etc. And then if you have a conceptual reasoning for that. And one last question that I think we can also address in this round is by Sarah Glynn. The question is as follows, also with a comment. I am always struck by the inherent contradiction between the idea of democratic confederalism as incorporating all different peoples living in a region and the emphasis on Kurdish unity. Can you comment on this and the risk of Kurdish unity sliding into a new ethnic nationalism? These are the first round questions in the chat. I would now suggest to have Birgül raise her question and then your answers. Sorry, I have to.
Virgül.
Oh, sorry. I've just muted. Thank you very much, Rosa. And thank you, Hamid. That was an amazing discussions and presentation. I just wanted a question about the becoming subject of their own history. And what I sense that there is a kind of top-down understanding of conceptualizations of this the subject or the kind of concept of becoming subject of their own history, because I see there's a kind of tension between understanding that and what's going on. And if we look at the Palestine issue and since the October 11, how it's supported globally, and is actually nothing more than the Palestinian has becoming subject of their own history for me. And that is really represented is the and the kind of support that we see everywhere. Because if we don't look at the everyday and the hidden resistance that the Palestine people have gone and look at only a particular spaces of politics and understanding politics from a particular perspective, i.e. what is legitimized and therefore what is civility or what is politics, then we understand the role of the civil society and the kind of ongoing struggles of the women and other struggles that you talked about it. And I think that's really important to elaborate on it, because I feel like the fact that it has become universally supported around the world and it's no longer the questions of Palestine issue, is represent the ongoing subject formations and the Palestinian people on the bottom, from the bottom, becoming their own subjectivity. And I think that's also related to a question that Rosa asked, why we actually do not have Kurdish issues to the same space, to kind of the same values on the space it is. And I think there's a lot of things to think about it in terms of what do we mean by process of self-subjectivation. Thank you very much. Again, I loved it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much for all these questions. Aisha, I think that your question is pertinent, but I will recommend you to read, if you probably you have read it or you know it, if it is not the case, to read the book of Osman Turan, who was a Turanist writer of 1960s, and his book is called Türk Cihan Hakimiyeti Mefkûresi, the idol of the world domination of Turks. I think that in the case of the United States, we are in a very different situation. We have, for two reasons. First, you have the doctrine of Monroe of 1829, 1830. I might be wrong about the dates. And in this doctrine, the South of America is defined as the zone of influence of the United States, but not as a zone of conquest. There is not 11th realm, but that's rather a place where the American interest should not and cannot be contested. And actually, basically, this doctrine has remained until the 1980s. Huh? And there is a second idea, which is dominant in the American history, and which has reached its acme or paroxystic point with Fukuyama in 1985, 1889, the end of history. It means that America has a historical mission to accomplish, but this historical mission is not to dominate the world, that this historical mission is to end the history of the world, to mark the triumph of liberal democratic bourgeoisie, the liberal bourgeois democracy, and to end with the historical passion, nationalism, socialism, interstate war, whatever you can imagine, that have dominated the world history in the 19th and 20th century. So I think that, and for America, 9/11, that was a shock, because they thought that the history has ended. And 9/11, history has started once again. So that's why I think that I will be very critical of the American foreign policies, of course, because I am from my generation, and I remember what happened in Chile in 1980, in 1973, in Turkey in 1980, etc. But at the same time, as I said, I will not consider it as a wish of constructing 11th realm. Dear Hanafi, I think that I have to think a little bit about your question. I use it actually as Marx used it. Issue is not a negative qualification. The women issue, the issue, racial issue, etc. For me, an issue is means has this advantage on occupation, on the concept of occupation or colonialism, whatever you can imagine. It includes the notion of, it implicitly includes the notion of struggle. It implicitly include the possibility of overcoming this situation through resistance, through struggle, through reforms, through negotiations, whatever you can imagine. And that's why I would prefer, for while being the concept of issue, but I have to think a little bit about this issue. Sarah, I think that your question is also a pertinent question. I will not be able to defend here democratic confederalism because I think that for while being what is going on in the Rojava is a regime of survival. This regime of survival means that we have to protect Rojava at any cost. And we will see in the future if the consolidation of Rojava has taken place, what form of, what political form the Rojava will take internally, what kind of relations it will have externally with the other parts of Kurdistan. But we can easily imagine very different options. One single independent Kurdistan, different independent or autonomous Kurdistan, an integrated Kurdish space that does not put into question the state borders, but at the same time exists as one single unity entity through transborder mechanisms of existence. You can easily imagine a Kurdish parliament which does not question the state's borders and at the same time works as a truly national parliament across the borders. So all these options, they are open, but for this, we need a political imagination. For this, we need the Kurdish decisions, of course. The Kurds as actors, as subjects, have to decide themselves what they want. But in order to do that, as I said, first, we need consolidation and survival. And Birgül, I think that you have also pointed a very important issue, because concerning the Kurds as well as concerning the Palestinians, for while being, they are objects. An object is not considered as having its own, his or her own will, her or his own capacity of reading his or her past, his or imagining his or her future. Remember what Sheikh Ubaidullah has said in 1880s. He was not always a very pleasant man, but he has explained what the Kurdish struggle was about. We want to judge ourselves, our criminals. That means we are subjects. We became national subjects. And so from that point of view, I think that this issue of struggling against the status of object in order to become a subject is a dominant issue, one of the most important issues for me, for all the dominant groups. Unfortunately, I will not share your opinion concerning the Palestinian issue becoming a popular and important issue after 7th of October. That's really not my reading. I think that Hamas bears a very strong, very heavy responsibility for that, because well, I will stop here, but I will say that the Palestinian issue itself, as such, has been considered and is still considered as a legitimate issue since the first Intifada. And the first Intifada from 1897 to 2001, no, 1887 to 1991, sorry, 1887 to 1991 was a very important moment, because the first Intifada was the Intifada of the municipalities. Until then, the Palestinian municipalities, they were remaining silent. After that period, the internal Palestine has voiced out. The first intifada was the intifada of women. For the first time in the Palestinian history, the women, they have not only become fidai, but they have become voices of civil society fighting both against against Israeli occupation and against the Palestinian patriarchal system. And that was the intifada of children and of adolescents. I think that from that point of view, when you see the historical legitimation of the Palestinian issue is there. And today, I think that the Palestinian actors, the Palestinian society, have to capitalize on this historical legitimacy in order to produce new alternatives and in order to get a place in the international arena. But as I said, no, the Hamas, the attack of Hamas on October 7th have, on the contrary, have harmed very much the Palestinian issue. That's at least my reading.
Thank you so much for addressing all the complexities also within the questions. My suggestion would now be we have some Kurdish questions, Kurdish written questions that Sardar will help now to address them. And then we would, for the audience, we would have for now, I think, a last opportunity to address questions to Professor Bozarslan. So you can write them down in the meantime.
Thank you, Rosa. For those of you who don't understand Kurdish, you can now change your channel, interpretation channel to English. مامۆستا چەند پرسەنە بە کوردی ئەزێوانە بخوێنم
کوردی بەرسەم یان بە ئینگلیزی بەرسە بدەم
تو بخوات چا حەزێکی وسا ئەنجام دکار یعنی ئەگەر بەشداروانن کوردی ئەمە گەلێکن ئەگەر کوردی و بەرسە بدەن بێ پڕ باش بە
باشە بەرێ
پرسە یەکەم نوژین حەسەن خوێندەکاری ئێمە مامۆستای زانگا ڕۆژاوا دەپرسە دەماکوان بەحسا ڕۆژهەڵاتە ناوین دکن ئەم تەنێ دکارن بەحسا توندوتیژیە بکن و ئەو یەک دەیەلەک و ئەم بپرسن گەلۆ کۆکان نەکۆکین ڕۆژهەڵاتە ناوین ji ku tê gelo vê rewşa rojhilata navîn ji rewşa îro baştir bibe ji bo bidestxistina destkeftiyên şert û mercên vê rewşê çi ne pirseke din jî ev e rola Hemasê di gurkirina tundutîjiyê de çi ye ji ber ku xuya dike ku tevgera Hemas rolekî mezin di arastekirina civaka Filistînî ber bi tundutîjiyê dilîze yani ji xwe ew mijar ve nîqaş kiribû pirsa duhemî lalê Gernasfrat jî hevala mamostaya me Zanînga Kobanî dipirse hûn têgeha şera cîhaniya sêhemî çawa dinirxînin di şer û berxwedana di sedsala bîst û yekemîn de çi guhertin hene û pirs berdewam dike ku rol û cihê gelê Kurd di nav vê têgehê de hûn çawa şirove dikin dîsa pirsekî din hebû li aliyê yek ji hevalên rêweberiya Zanîngeha Rojava mamosta Aram Hesan ew jî dipirse ji bo guhertina rewşa rojhilata navîn û derbaskirina kaosa ku niha heye li gorî we şert û mercên ku divê bên bi cîh anîn çi ne li gorî nêrîna we rola Kurdan di guhertinê de wê hebe yan na ew jî nêzîkê ew pirsê mamosta Gernas bû pirsa dawî li aliyê Hesen Ebdo el Elî hatiye kirin dibêje ku em dizanin ku koalîsyona navdewletî Rojava de bi habişî bi hêzên Sûriya Demokratîk re operasyonan dimeşînin û şerê cîhadiyên îslamîst dikin çima dwarê siyasî de jî ji bo pejirandina rêweberiya xweser de gavên diyar nehatine avêtin û çima li hember êrişên Tirkiye li ser binêsaziyên sivîl Rojava bêdengî heye ez bawerim pirs ev in pirsên Kurdî pirsên İngilîzî berdewam dibin mamosta Keremke
بله gelek spas tek celil rastya gelek minnettarım iştera gelek spaslarım ezip kurdi berse bizim ezip kurdi berse bizim bu ban her çarpırsan da gerek spas bavarım بۆ پرسە پێشینە دەبێژم کو ینی میراسێکی پڕ گران هەیە میراسێکی گران هەیە و ڕۆژدا قەڵەوی کرد ینی 1915 24 مەها چاران 24 نیسانە قەتلیامە ئەرمێنیان قەتلیامە مەسیحیان دن ینی دیرۆکە ڕۆژەلەتە نابین دیرۆکی گەلێکەکەی دژوارە و تەنێ نە مەسەلا ئەوەزی ینی واتەکەوە رژیمە سەدام حوسێن دەگرن رژیمە باشار حافظ الاسد دەگرن رژیمên din digirin ew Türkiyeyekî miraseke pir heye yani kûr heye li wê Rojava navîn ne tenê ye yani wateke hûn Avrupa mê dikin dîroka Avrupa mê dikin 1870 heta 1945 dîroka Avrupayê rastî dîrokê gelek dijwar e û ev yê îro Rojava navîn de zîwsankiye yani gere tewrek hel bibe marî zanê çawan be û ev ya pirsa erkê dibin yani pirsa kek Arap Hasan bunzî şart û şurût çineke em ji vê kaosê derkevin em ji vê dîroka şîddetê derkevin ez bawerim ke îro tiştê mihîmtirîn hewe tenê pir zehmeteke mavê bika ke Tirkiye û İran destê xwe nexin Rojava navîn Sûriyede problem hene Rojava heye hikûmeta Sûriye heye kuvwetên din hene ki pirsa Sûriye bibe pirsa Sûriye bixwe ki aktörên Sûriye û aktörên mesela bêjin ke navneteya dinê karbin bi şeklek ewronîkin û pirsê xwe ew hel bikin ki mesela Iraqê bibo mesela Iraqê bixwe ki İran û Tirkiye nekevin pê ki mesela Yemenê bibo mesela Yemenê ki mesela Libyayê bibo mesela Libyayê ki aktörên hundirî karbin ew bi hevra bidin bistînin ew sereçariyek bibînin wê wextê belkî rehettir be ki em ji vê kaosê derkevîn tene heta ki aktörên derve Sûriye Tirkiye û İran û qismen zî Rusya û heta ke têda be ji bo min gelek zehmet xwe ki em ji vê kaosê derkevîn û belkî diviya da Avrupa kaybe rolek bileyze li belê îro Avrupa gelek zayıf e belki Amerika sibê kaybe rolek bileyze li îro pêşedema Amerika zî pir eşkeran ne yani di Trump bê ser kar di Trump ne ser kar Amerika di cesaret bika kuvweta wî hebe tune be yani dinek faktörên sankî belkî derkevin meydanê belkî civata giştî sivîl kaybe rolek bileyze tene yani wekim got yani îro tiştê zehmettirîn ew e ku wexteke problemek derskeve belki aktörün Suriye tuhafına bakıda ben çareserlik bibinin tene Türkiye te silah da diya İran te silah da diya ve diye amatışlarına gerek zahmettir. Mesela Hamas'ı vekum got em hezi nizamin ki eve bir yere dair. Yani ihtimali ki pırpırmazın serokiya siyasiye Hamas'ı tedane bu. İhtimali ki pırmazın İsmail Haniye agadariye ve binjbiyetine bu. O evye nişandaki teşkilatı ki ev ki yani teşkilat ki bir seriye nişandaki hani aktörün ve teşkilatı otonomik van pırmadan hene o ev otonomi tevimane ku bir yarın ki serokitiya siyasi de nay kabul kırın o hundur da nay takip kırın o evye bu megelek problemi o bağırın trajediye Gazay'da evye de roleki gerek mazlum değildi. Şerê sisyanê cîhanê ez evî bawer nakim bi hendikî îro bawer nakim yani rojaleta navîn xwe pir mezin nîşan dide tenê rojaleta navîn merkeza stratejiya dinê ne yani belkî 30 sal berê sankî bûn belkî 40 sal berê sankî bûn îro ez zanim ke heye yani dimasyonekê eskatolojik heye rojaleta navîn da fikrên mehedîtiyê hene Mesyanizma İsrail'e heye, Mehditiye İran'e heye, Mesyanizma evangelist heye Amerika'yı, ev Mesyanizm rolek deyizin, dışarıda bir rolek deyizin, teni rol evan Mesyanizma rastı ilo gerek kemen. Yani rejiyi bavarım ki herkes tuhazı, mesela İran bu İran'ı Hizbullah üyevekli dibece, emsar nakhwazin, İran dibece emsar nakhwazin, em tuhazin ki nüfuza me be kabul kırın. Eğer gon me ve kuvveteki hegemonik kabul bikin, nüfuza me kabul bikin, وچه إسرائيل وفلسطين بما برمهمنا يعني قوتارا إيران وحزب الله واتك متخينن أبيا در كده ميدان تركيا قوتا ما قبول بكن نفوذا ما قبول بكن كردان جورت راكن problem نامينه يعني herkes سرك نفوذ دايه تنه یک زبان سرن نفوذ نابن سرن استراتيجيك كروجلا سياسة الدنيا يبقى سياسة الدنيا جوري كي ترمزن هذا جري كرت كاري شبكة ديادا وكم قلت يعني جري كرت كاري yani peşe her şeyde entegrasyon akıya honduri çeke. Eğer geri Kürt karbo nava başur u Rojava'da entegrasyonu ki honduri çeke. Nişanbıdaki Kürt navanda faksi hebben siyaset olan aynine bezi, dirok olan aynine bezi serxeze kın. O karım bersve ki bu bidin Rojava tanavin, bidin İran'e, bidin Türkiye kuvvet avan yani nüfuz avan kempkin. وچه اگه باورم ده فاکتوری که مازم ده جبو کردان و دبو که جبو روجالا تناوی ندی گلک فاکتوری که باشه ده و پرسا داوین پرسا که حسن بله yani ezanım که امریکا و هنی دولتندن به هیزن دموکراتیک کردستانی را کارتکن روجاوا را کارتکن اللي بله aynı وقت ده پیشیز ترکیه ناستینن احتیاج boyumuz gerek problemi kemadına, gerek duruti kemadına zni, gerek dijide derkedin, gerek her şeyde cebe gotun. Ez bavarım ki hatta ki Biden ser karbon, Amerika'nın naxwazın Kurdan hıyanet bikin. Yani eğer bir derkevin dijir Rojava'yı, tuhazım bir teorik ki kuvveta Kurdistan, kuvveta Rojava ser piyamine, tene evye ternake, ez evi zanım, jibuizi belki gerek Kurd bir şekilde diplomasi, riyen diplomasi no bir karbinin, hem Suriye hem Rojava tanavinde hem Zirciye'nden. Gerek spas.
Basmamız.
Thank you. Also, Jalil, thank you for offering your translation. This is really saving all of us, I think. There are three more questions that I will address, that I will present you, and two of them, the third one I have not read yet. I will in a minute. Two of them actually are a continuation of the last topics. And it kind of fits also with the question on internal integration in the Kurdish issue and also Israel-Palestine. One question is raised by Veysida. He is sending his greetings from Jerusalem right now, and his question is, to what extent is the Gaza war a war of imperial Iranian and Turkish war at expenses of Palestinians? And how do you read the intentions of both imperial Iranian and Turkish states by demonizing Israel and connecting the Kurdish struggle with the Zionist project? This is the question. Another colleague, Pınar Dinç, is thanking you for the presentation and is asking, she says, my question is more about recent developments in the region, especially the interactions and agreements between Turkey and Iraq. You often stress the importance of Kurdish unity and the Kurds' ability to manage their internal fragmentation. In light of the current developments, what would be your predictions for the near future and its impact on the Kurdish struggle, especially in the autonomous administration in North and East Syria? So I think there is a lot of overlap, but maybe there is something that you would still want to address. And one last question is by Nazan Bedirhanoğlu. She's also thanking you, and she says, I wonder if Mamuste sees a way out of this bleak picture of annihilation of civilization, the destruction of urbanity, civilization, time and space. What, at least, is the responsibility and role of intellectuals? Until recently, it seemed that the democratic deficit of or the gap between different countries allowed for the intervention of intellectuals, but this window of opportunity seems to be shrinking in the face of recent pressures on academic freedom in the West. What is to be done? And I think this is a perfect last question, actually. Thank you, Nazan, also for making the perfect last question. Thank you.
Thank you for these two questions. Concerning the question of Iran-Turkey competitions, and even more than competitions actually, because there are serious conflicts going on, and anti-Kurdish positions, they can bring together Turkey and Iran to some extent, the anti-Israeli positions too. And at the same time, I think that there's main conflicts that's not about Israel, not even about Turkey, about the Kurdish issue. That's much more about the regional hegemony. And as I said, one has the impression to return back to the 16th century. And that from that point of view, actually, when you read the 16th century, history of the 16th century, you are absolutely stuck that you have some continuities, some elements of continuities over the two periods. So in the 16th century, from the Iranian side, the Safavid side, you had a very clear messianism, while from the Ottoman side, you didn't have any kind of messianism, but you had the will of imposing the Sunni Turkish domination through integration of the Kurds. So that was the deal. And today, I see that in Iran, you have an eschatological dimension, you have a messianic dimension, much less stronger than during the Ahmadinejad, the first Ahmadinejad mandate, but which is still there. While in Turkey, as far as I see, there is no messianism, no eschatological dimension at all. But at the same time, in Turkey, there is this will of being the dominant actor in the region. And paradoxically, I would say that anti-Semitism is probably much more stronger in Turkey than in Iran. I might be wrong, but I think that these factors have to be taken into account. But as I said, in any case, the conflict, the very cynical conflicts of hegemony and ideological conflicts also between Turkey and Iran will not be overcome easily. And Pinar, thank you for your question too. It is very difficult to see actually what will happen in the future, in the very near future. My impression is that the Kurdish political public opinion in Bashur is massively pro-Kurdish in Turkey. The Kurdish actors of Turkey are very popular in Turkey, in Iran, Iraq. The Kurdish case in the Kurdish struggle in Turkey is very popular in the Iraqi Kurdistan, and it is very difficult for me to see how the Iraqi Kurds will collaborate actively, at least, with Turkey in order to crash down the PKK forces. And I don't see neither actually a serious collaboration between Iraq, where Iran has a strong domination, and Turkey, not either. Until now, in contrast with the 1980s, the Kurds have been able to manage their conflicts. There is a kind of informal international Kurdish space of negotiation and arbitration. As I see, this informal space is still working. There are a lot of tensions. I am aware of these tensions. There are a lot of discontent, and I think that this discontent has to be also recognized. And at the same time, this informal system of negotiation and arbitration is still working. And it can be very interesting if the international community supported this informal system of arbitration and negotiation. And I think that it can be very important also to mobilize the Kurdish public opinion. The Kurdish public opinion is to some extent very tired, I know that. But at the same time, when you see, for instance, the Kurdish civil war in Iraq in the 1990s, the war has ended because the Kurdish public opinion, the Kurdish civil society has been mobilized. So I think many things can be done. As I said, international communities, involvement, as I said, the mobilization of the Kurdish civil society, all these factors have to be taken into account. And concerning the last question, in any case, I think that many intellectuals have found themselves in the 1920s, 1930s, exactly facing this question. The tragedy of 1920s, 1930s was that no one, neither Ernest Cassirer, nor Bloch, nor Klaus Mann, nor Thomas Mann, nor Hannah Arendt couldn't imagine or understand how Europe was falling into a period of decivilization and such a degree of cruelty. It can be interesting to read today their work. And in any case, say that intellectual struggle is absolutely crucial. Intellectual struggle is not exclusively an academic struggle. That's also cultural creativity. That's also artistic creativity. There's also a capacity of forming, building circles of socialization. There's a capacity of linking, bridging different generations among themselves, because we have a very important generational gaps in Turkey, yeah? and including among the Kurds, because the former Kurdish militant generation today is 70, 80 years old. The youngest ones are 15, 20. So they have to bridge themselves. And culture and intellectual activities, that's a part of this. But I think that the intellectual life is not the only life. We need also other forms of socializations, underground socializations, open socializations, circles of friendship, circles of resistance, circles of singing, whatever you can imagine. I know that we are in a very bad period, but at the same time, this period might be a short period. I have no idea. I know that at least in Europe, we are not in the context of 1920s, 1930s, because 1920s, 1930s in Europe was in the aftermath of the World War One. In the 1920s, 1930s, the idea of Lebensraum, social Darwinism, were dominant in many places, which is not the case today. So the context is very different. And we have some optimistic light coming from Poland, from Austria, for instance. So I think that we should not capitulate and saying that everything is over, being very much aware of the difficult conditions and continue.
Thank you so much for the last response. And also, this leads us to actually conclude the session today, but also, I mean, we are always talking about very, very dark periods, because we always talk about legacies of violence that are ongoing. But I always feel like when we listen to you and we have all these insights, there is also some sort of comfort in knowing that we can make sense of it. And so we can go beyond or look beyond it, remain hopeful in the end. So thank you very much, Mamoste. It was amazing. Always, like always, I think I can speak for everybody here. We really enjoyed enjoyed your lecture, and we feel very grateful. And also thank you, Sardar, for inviting me to be the moderator. And now I would hand it over to you to conclude the session.
Thank you, Rosa. Gelek spas. Mamosta gelek spas. Thank you so much. This was a very, very important, very needed conversation. And I can join many others who are writing in the chat that we learned a lot. So thank you for that. Thank you for your contribution to Kurdish academia, for accepting our invitation. I hope to have more of you, more of the Kurdish academics with the University of Rojava, with the universities of Northeast Syria. They really need that. And Rosa ended with a note of hope. I think it is very important that we have this hope as part of solidarity campaign with the universities of Northeast Syria. They're unfortunately very much missed and invisible among academia in the West, and when it comes to solidarity, many people, as Nazan mentioned, in academia, they're struggling with their solidarity with Palestine, with what's happening in Gaza. But we need to remind them that the other contexts are also out there where violence has been going on for a long time. And thank you very much to Jalil Kaya, extending our deepest gratitude, who took on the interpretation work for this lecture. The poster designer of the lecture, who lives in Turkey, unfortunately has to remain anonymous, and to all of those who helped us to organize this. Before ending the lecture, I would like to remind that the Institute is working on many projects, talks, and we have done many summer schools in the past on the different topics. And this summer, we are working on a summer school program on the theme of nationalism and its alternatives, the role of education. Details of this summer school will be shared soon. Please follow the university's Facebook and/or Twitter page for more. And also, I shared the website for the Center for Solidarity with Alternative Universities, which is the center in Paris working with the universities of Northeast Syria, providing them with different sorts of support. And you can basically check the website for some updates. And with that, we come to an end to our lecture today. Thank you so much for joining, and keep well wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. That was a honor to be with you.
Thank you.